I am Eleanor Whitmore, a 69-year-old woman from Hackney, London, and I belong to the baby boomer generation. When I look back on my childhood, I see a world both familiar and fragmented, shaped by the echoes of a war my parents had survived but rarely spoke about. Britain in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a country learning to rebuild itself, and families like mine were at the heart of that effort. Life was modest, measured and often restrained, yet beneath the ordinary routines, the scars of wartime Britain were quietly present. Our streets still bore the marks of air raids, patched bricks, boarded windows, and the lingering silence of empty lots where houses once stood. Children played in the open spaces, finding adventure in rubble and overgrown gardens, unaware that these remnants of destruction were reminders of what my parents had endured. Shops rationed goods, and many families relied on ingenuity to stretch meager supplies, making every loaf of bread, every can of tea, a small act of survival. The social structure around us was slowly evolving. The National Health Service had just been established, bringing hope and access to care, while communities clung to solidarity in a world that felt precarious. In my home, life moved with careful routines. My mother, Margaret, managed the house with quiet diligence, balancing domestic duties with the unspoken responsibilities of emotional preservation. My father, Charles, worked long hours to provide, often carrying invisible burdens from experiences he had never fully shared. Conversations about the war were rare, yet their influence was everywhere in the careful way my mother conserved food, in my father's cautious guidance, in the atmosphere of cautious optimism that filled our flat. I learned early that resilience often spoke in whispers, not in loud declarations. School life was a mixture of discipline and camaraderie. We were encouraged to aim high, yet the economy and society were still recovering. Our teachers instilled a sense of duty and propriety, but outside the classroom, the world felt unpredictable. Communities were tight-knit. Neighbors helped one another, and children quickly learned to adapt to shortages, unexpected changes, and the lessons carried in the silence of adults who had survived more than their words could convey. The city itself was alive with contrast steam from factories mixing with the scent of baked bread, trams clattering along uneven streets, and voices from every corner reflecting the resilience of a population learning to hope again. As a girl growing up in Hackney, I became acutely aware of how the past shaped the present. Even the smallest moments, a family gathering, a story told over tea, a photograph on the mantelpiece held layers of history that I could sense but not yet fully comprehend. These were the threads that would later form the foundation of my understanding, that our lives are connected to those who came before, and that memory, care and endurance are inherited in ways far more powerful than we realize. It is from this backdrop of post-war Britain, a society in recovery, filled with quiet resilience, that I began to understand the importance of memory and storytelling. The experiences of my parents, grandparents, and the community around us shaped who I am today. Every brick in Hackney, every rationed loaf, and every whispered conversation carried lessons I would carry with me across oceans, shaping not only my life in the United Kingdom, but also the new life I would eventually build far from home. This is why I must tell this story, not just my story, but the story of a family whose ordinary days were extraordinary in their endurance, whose quiet courage deserves to be remembered. If I do not tell it, the lives of those who came before me and the lessons they imparted will fade into silence. And so, I write not for recognition, not for reward, but to preserve a legacy that belongs to all of us. I was born in 1956 in a quiet street in Hackney, at a time when the United Kingdom was trying to rebuild not only its homes, but also the spirit of its people. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and although my childhood came long after the final sirens stopped echoing across London, the war lived inside my family in ways that shaped everything around me. The adults rarely used dramatic words. They simply carried memories in their posture, in their pauses, in the way they looked toward the sky whenever an aircraft passed. As a child, I sensed something lingering beneath our daily routines, a kind of silence that had its own presence. My earliest memories are tied to the small brick house where I grew up. The neighborhood was still recovering from the post-war years, and even in the late 50s and early 60s, you could see buildings that had never been restored, left as quiet reminders of what had once happened. People walked past those empty lots without staring, but no one completely ignored them either. They were part of the city's rhythm, part of its character, much like the families who carried their own unseen scars. My mother, Margaret, was a warm but cautious woman. She tried her best to give me a peaceful upbringing, yet I could always feel a kind of invisible weight behind her movements. When I asked why she kept a small emergency bag near the door, she would say it simply made her feel safe. She never raised her voice, never panicked, but she lived with a readiness that I didn't understand as a child. Only years later did I realize that her instincts were shaped when she was a little girl, during nights filled with uncertainty. My father, Thomas, was quieter than my mother. He had an easy smile, but there was a distance in his eyes that I learned to read long before I could write. He worked long hours as a mechanic, returning home with the smell of engine oil on his jacket. Some evenings he would sit alone at the small table by the kitchen window, staring outside as if he were waiting for something only he could see. He never said exactly what he experienced during the war, but he didn't have to. His silence carried more history than any story he could have told. Life in Britain during my childhood was shaped by a sense of rebuilding. The older generation focused on responsibility and resilience. That was the tone of the era. People worked, saved, kept a sense of order in their homes. My parents believed that structure protected a family, even if they rarely said it outright. I followed their rules without question because I sensed that the world had not always been as predictable as it seemed to me. There was a seriousness woven into our days, not oppressive, but steady. What I remember most are the moments when the past intruded in small, almost invisible ways. When a car backfired in the street, my mother's shoulders lifted ever so slightly. When a newspaper printed a story about international conflict, my father would fold the paper more slowly than usual, as if the words felt heavier. These reactions were gentle, never frightening, but they told me that the past was not something you simply left behind. It seeped into habits, into pauses in conversation, into the tone of a sigh. At school, I quickly learned that many of my classmates came from families with similar histories. Their parents had also lived through long nights of worry, and their grandparents carried their own memories. The adults rarely discussed details, but the atmosphere of post-war Britain still lingered in the lessons we learned. We were taught to appreciate stability, to show respect, to understand that peace was precious even if we didn't fully grasp why. What shaped me most, though, was the sense that I was walking on the edge of a story that belonged to the people who raised me. I heard fragments my mother mentioning her evacuation as a child. My father making a brief comment about long shifts and colder nights, but the details were always left unsaid. I felt as if there was an entire world hidden beneath their silence, a world I wasn't yet old enough to enter. By the time I reached my teens, I had already become a quiet observer. I watched my parents carefully, trying to understand the spaces between their words. I didn't know then that these small observations would one day become my inheritance, the subtle clues that would help me piece together the story they never fully told. Even though I hadn't lived through the conflict, I felt its presence in my home like an echo that refused to fade. As an adult, I would come to understand how deeply the past shaped everything, the way I reacted to uncertainty, the way I valued simple routines, the way I carried a sense of responsibility, even when no one asked it of me. The war had ended long before I was born, yet its legacy lived through my parents and finally settled in me. And perhaps that is why, now at 69, I feel such an urgency to tell this story. It was never just their story. It became mine as well. My grandfather, Arthur, was the only member of my family who spoke about the past with a steadiness that felt almost deliberate, as if he believed silence could cause history to fade. He lived in a modest flat in Islington, filled with the soft ticking of clocks he repaired as a hobby. Whenever I visited him as a child, I sensed that time meant something different to him. He observed it carefully, as though he had once lived through days when each minute carried more weight than ordinary life could explain. I was 9 when he first revealed that my mother's childhood had been shaped by more than fear. He told me in the same tone he used to describe the weather, standing by the kitchen window while a faint drizzle traced lines down the glass. He explained that during the war, when she was only a girl, she had been evacuated to the countryside for safety. I had heard the word before in school, but it had always sounded like a historical detail, something distant and impersonal. Hearing it connected to my mother made it suddenly real. According to my grandfather, she had been sent to a village in Kent. At the time, London was facing regular disruptions, and the authorities made decisions meant to protect children from uncertainty. Many families followed the guidance, trusting that separation, temporary as they hoped it would be, was safer than remaining in areas affected by the tension of those days. My mother was placed with a couple who cared for several children, and although they treated her well, she never stopped longing for home. My grandfather said she wrote letters every week, but the postal system struggled, and not all of them reached their destination. He did not tell me this dramatically. He spoke as someone sharing facts he had carried for years. What unsettled me most was not the story itself, but his expression as he told it. His face remained composed, but his eyes had a softness that made me understand that memory still touched him deeply. He said, "My mother returned to London carrying a maturity beyond her age. She had learned to observe before speaking, and she became a child who listened closely to every shift in a room." The war was over, but her instincts had been shaped during months when uncertainty had been part of her routine. When he finished telling me this, he handed me a small wooden box he kept in a drawer lined with old newspapers. Inside were items from my mother's childhood: a cloth handkerchief embroidered with her initials, a small notebook filled with uneven handwriting, and a faded photograph of her standing in a field with other children. She had a timid smile, the kind a child wears when she wants to look brave. I held the photograph gently, sensing that it was more than an image. It was a piece of the story my family rarely spoke aloud. As I grew older, I began asking my grandfather questions whenever I visited him. He always gave thoughtful answers, never sensationalizing what had happened. He believed that recounting the past was a responsibility, not a performance. He explained that many families in the United Kingdom had lived through similar experiences. The aftermath shaped how people moved forward, influencing their priorities, their habits, and their expectations of life. My grandfather said resilience became essential, not just as a concept, but as something families practiced daily. He would sometimes mention the evenings during the war when he and my grandmother kept the house quiet, hoping that calm routines would comfort their children. He never described these moments with intensity. He focused instead on how people helped one another and how communities supported families who needed reassurance. He emphasized compassion and unity values he believed the country had carried into the post-war years. I absorbed these stories carefully, realizing they were part of the foundation on which my family had been built. One afternoon, when I was about 15, I asked my grandfather whether he ever felt angry about what his family had endured. He shook his head. He said life often presents challenges, and the way people respond to them defines their future. His goal had always been to ensure that my mother felt secure after returning home. He admitted that she struggled with certain anxieties throughout her life, but he believed she had grown strong because she understood the importance of stability. His calmness during the conversation made me think about my own place in this history. I realized that although I had never lived through the events he described, they had shaped me indirectly. My awareness of my parents' quiet behaviors, their guardedness, and their careful habits began to make more sense. Their experiences influenced the atmosphere in which I grew up, guiding the choices I made without my ever recognizing it. The more I learned from my grandfather, the more I sensed that he had been the anchor of our family. He carried the memories that others avoided, not to relive them, but to protect them from being lost. His stories allowed me to see my parents through a new lens, understanding the roots of their silence and the reasons behind their measured ways of moving through the world. When my grandfather passed away many years later, I found myself returning to the wooden box he had once handed me. I opened it slowly, remembering the way he had encouraged me to learn, observe, and preserve the past with care. Inside, everything was just as I remembered: the handkerchief, the notebook, the photograph. But this time, the items felt heavier, filled with a meaning I hadn't fully grasped as a child. Now, at 69, I realize that my grandfather entrusted me with something more than objects. He gave me the responsibility of carrying forward the story he guarded so diligently. He believed that a family's history should not fade simply because it is difficult to tell, and as I reflect on his gentle voice and steady presence, I understand why it is essential for me to continue what he began. I grew up believing that silence was a normal part of family life, not a cold silence, but a thoughtful one, the kind that lingered in the corners of rooms and settled into daily routines without anyone acknowledging it. As a child, I accepted it without question. Only later did I realize that silence was the language my parents used when memories became too heavy to speak aloud. Their unspoken experiences seeped into my childhood like a quiet shadow, shaping my behavior long before I understood why. Our house in Hackney was small, with thin walls that carried every sound of the neighborhood. I could hear neighbors greeting each other on the street, children kicking a football against a brick wall, and trains rumbling in the distance. Yet inside our home, the atmosphere felt different. My parents moved with a calm caution, as if noise itself needed to be handled carefully. When visitors came, my mother's smile brightened, but after they left, she always took a long breath before returning to her tasks, as though she had been holding something inside. One of my earliest memories is of sitting on the living room floor with my toys while my father read the newspaper. A sudden noise outside a bin falling or a slammed car door made him glance toward the window with an instinctive tension. The moment passed quickly, and he returned to his reading, but I never forgot that subtle shift in his posture. I didn't understand it then, but it became familiar over the years. It was the quiet mark of a man whose youth had been shaped by moments when sound meant uncertainty. These small reactions accumulated, becoming part of the environment I grew up in. Even though my parents rarely mentioned their past, I sensed that it influenced everything around us. My mother always kept the pantry well stocked, buying extra tins of food even when we didn't need them. She organized the cupboards with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial. My father double-checked the latches on the windows each night, tapping them gently before turning off the lights. None of this felt alarming. It simply became the rhythm of our household. At school, I noticed differences between my family and the families of some of my classmates. A few children were loud and carefree at home in ways I couldn't imagine. They spoke of parents who were relaxed about clutter, who laughed loudly at dinner, who let unexpected visitors drop in without preparation. I didn't envy them, but I observed them with fascination, trying to understand how a home could feel so spontaneous. My home felt safe, structured, and respectful of the past, even when that past was never fully explained. My childhood involved an unusual habit I developed without realizing it. I listened more than I spoke. My teachers commented on it often, calling it maturity, though it wasn't really that. I simply believed that people revealed more through what they didn't say. My mother's pauses, my father's careful breathing, their quiet glances at one another, these taught me that emotions could be large even when words were small. I learned to read moods the way some children learn music, detecting subtle changes in tone before anyone else noticed. There were moments, however, when the past surfaced unexpectedly. Once, when I was about 10, I found my mother sitting near the back door holding a small envelope. Her eyes looked distant, as though she were seeing something far beyond the yard. When she realized I was there, she tucked the envelope away and smiled gently. I didn't ask what it contained. I already understood that some questions were not meant to be asked until one was older, if ever. My father had his own quiet rituals. On Sunday evenings, he would sit by the radio, listening to broadcasts with a concentration that made the entire room feel still. He never shared his thoughts afterward, but I could sense that the world beyond our home concerned him in ways he didn't disclose. There was a seriousness in him that shaped my understanding of adulthood. I believed grown-ups lived with responsibilities that children could not yet grasp. As I entered adolescence, I began recognizing which parts of my personality came from this atmosphere. I avoided loud arguments, not out of fear, but because raised voices felt unnatural to me. I kept my belongings organized, mirroring the patterns I saw in my mother. I felt uneasy during sudden changes of plan, preferring routines that felt steady and predictable. While my peers embraced spontaneity, I found comfort in certainty, unaware that this tendency had its roots in a history I had never lived. The echoes of my parents' past followed me into every stage of my youth. When teachers discussed wartime Britain in history lessons, my classmates saw photographs and statistics. I saw my mother wearing an expression she never described, and my father reacting to noises he tried to ignore. The lessons connected to things I had sensed intuitively but could not articulate. Even though I had not experienced the events myself, their effects lived quietly within me, shaping my reactions to the world. Looking back now, I realize that my childhood taught me resilience in an unusual form. Not the resilience built from hardship, but the resilience built from observation. I learned patience from my father's steady routines and strength from my mother's calm persistence. Their silence was not empty. It was full of lessons they hoped I would understand one day. As I approached adulthood, I began to see that the echoes shaping me were not simply remnants of their past. They were threads that connected generations, weaving a story I would eventually need to uncover. I didn't know yet that the responsibility to carry this history forward would eventually fall to me. But even as a child, I sensed that the past was not entirely behind us. It lived quietly in our home, waiting for the moment I would be old enough to listen fully. Leaving the United Kingdom was not something I had planned when I was young. For most of my life, I expected to remain in London, close to the familiar streets, the steady rhythm of buses, and the quiet routines that shaped my sense of belonging. Yet, when I turned 23, life began to unfold in a way that felt both unexpected and inevitable. I had reached an age where I wanted to understand the world beyond my childhood, but I also sensed that the weight of my family's past still held me in place. It was a strange tension, one that pushed me forward while urging me to remain cautious. I met Michael, the man who would later become my husband, during a summer exchange program. He was American, working temporarily in the United Kingdom to gain experience in the healthcare field. He had a natural confidence that contrasted with my reserved tendencies, and although his personality felt unfamiliar at first, it also intrigued me. He approached life with an openness that I rarely saw in the families I grew up around, many of whom carried the thoughtful quietness that echoed through post-war Britain. Michael and I spent long afternoons walking along the Thames, talking about our childhoods and the futures we imagined. He spoke about the United States with a warmth that made it sound vast and full of opportunity. His stories painted a picture of a country where reinvention was possible, where people embraced change without hesitation. I didn't know then how significant those conversations would become, but each one planted a seed in my mind. I began to consider the possibility that my life might expand beyond the boundaries of the city that had shaped me. As our relationship deepened, I found myself torn between two worlds. London was familiar, steady, and deeply connected to my family's history. It grounded me, but it also reminded me of the memories my parents kept tucked away. The house where I grew up held layers of unspoken stories, shadows that lingered even after I moved into my own small flat. Moving to another country felt almost like stepping out from under those shadows, though I never would have described it that way at the time. I only knew that something inside me was quietly urging me to see what lay beyond the life I had always known. When Michael asked if I would consider moving to the United States with him, I hesitated. The thought of leaving my parents, my neighborhood, and the familiar cadence of daily life felt overwhelming. At the same time, I sensed that if I didn't take that step, I might spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had. My parents, despite their reserved nature, supported my decision with gentle encouragement. My mother hugged me longer than usual the night I told her, and my father offered a quiet nod that conveyed both pride and a hint of worry. They understood that I was chasing something they had never been able to pursue when they were young. The flight across the Atlantic felt surreal. I looked out the window as the United Kingdom faded beneath the clouds, feeling both excitement and a deep ache I had not anticipated. I carried with me a small notebook filled with the addresses of family members, and a photograph of my parents standing in our garden, smiling proudly, but with a familiar softness in their eyes. I knew I would return to visit, but stepping onto unfamiliar soil meant acknowledging that my life would no longer be centered in the place where it began. Arriving in the United States was a shift unlike anything I had experienced before. The streets felt larger, the accents unfamiliar, and the pace of life more expansive than the structured routines I had grown up with. People spoke openly, sometimes sharing personal stories within minutes of meeting me. At first, this openness unsettled me. I had been raised to measure my words, to observe before speaking, and to listen carefully. Here, it seemed that people believed honesty flowed best when it was unfiltered. Michael helped me adjust, guiding me through each new experience with patience. He introduced me to his family, who welcomed me with warmth that felt almost overwhelming. Their gatherings were lively, filled with overlapping conversations and spontaneous laughter. I appreciated their kindness, yet a part of me always compared these moments to the subdued gatherings of my own childhood. The contrast highlighted just how deeply my early years in Britain had shaped my understanding of family and emotion. As months passed, I found a routine of my own. I took a job at a small library where the quiet atmosphere reminded me of home. Even so, I sensed that I carried two versions of myself, the cautious observer shaped by my parents' unspoken memories, and the newer version learning to navigate a world that operated with fewer restraints. It took time for me to understand how these two identities could coexist. Despite the excitement of building a new life, I often found myself thinking about the stories my family never told. Distance made their silence feel heavier, not lighter. I realized that leaving the United Kingdom did not separate me from my history. It only made me more aware of the pieces I still didn't understand. I carried their past with me across an ocean, and I knew that one day I would have to confront the stories that had shaped us all. Looking back now, I see that moving to the United States marked the beginning of my search for clarity. It wasn't just a journey to a new country. It was a step toward understanding the emotional legacy of my family. The echoes of the past remained with me, soft but persistent, reminding me that no matter how far I traveled, the roots of my identity began long before I was born. I remember the day the letter arrived, not because of what it contained, but because of how the air in the kitchen seemed to tighten around us. I was 13, old enough to understand tone, but still too young to grasp the full weight of adult worry. My mother had been sorting laundry when the envelope slid through the letterbox and landed, with a soft scrape on the hallway floor. It was thin, ordinary, nothing like the official envelopes she kept from her own childhood, the ones she had stored away with a mixture of fear and reverence. Yet something about the handwriting made her pause. She picked it up carefully, as though the paper itself might crumble. I watched from the doorway as she traced her thumb across her name. My father, who normally ignored the mail altogether, looked up from the table where he was sketching ideas for a new fixture he planned to build. His attention shifted the moment he saw my mother's expression. He set his pencil down and straightened his back, the way he always did when he sensed that something might stir memories he preferred to keep still. She opened it slowly, and as her eyes moved across the page, the color drained from her face. I could feel the quiet shift of energy in the room. My father stood beside her and read over her shoulder. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They shared a look loaded with unspoken history, something that had started long before my brother and I were born. It was the look of people who had carried too much for too long. When she finally placed the letter on the counter, I waited for an explanation, but she walked past me, wiped her hands on her apron, and told me to fetch my brother from the garden. Her voice was calm, but it wasn't her usual calm. It was the kind she used when she was trying not to show fear. That afternoon, they sat us both at the table. My mother folded her hands together, as though bracing herself. My father leaned back, staring at a point on the wall behind us, rather than at our faces. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then she explained that the letter came from a distant cousin, someone my brother and I barely knew, who claimed to have found a set of journals belonging to our grandfather. Not the cheerful grandfather from Sunday lunches, but the one who had lived through the war and had never spoken much about it. I didn't understand why this mattered. Journal entries from decades ago didn't seem threatening. But to my parents, they were a door opening into a room they had spent their whole lives avoiding. My mother kept smoothing the hem of her skirt, a small, restless motion she didn't seem aware of. My father's eyes remained fixed on the same spot on the wall. It was as though the letter had released something fragile and unwelcome into the room. After the conversation, I found the envelope on the counter and looked at it again. It was plain and harmless, but I felt a strange pull toward it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what might be written in those journals, what kind of person my grandfather had been before he became the quiet man who handed me peppermint sweets and carved wooden toys in the garden shed. The following days were filled with a cautious anticipation. My parents didn't speak about the letter again, not even to each other. They moved around the house as though stepping carefully over invisible cracks. I watched them, trying to understand what they feared. My mother's eyes often drifted toward the window, the way they had when I was little, and she expected something she couldn't name. My father spent more time in the shed, sanding the same piece of wood until its edges were almost too soft to touch. When the second letter arrived a week later, this time containing a small sample of the journal pages, my parents reacted even more strongly. My mother stood frozen in the doorway as she read. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled. My father took the pages from her and read them silently, his expression shifting in subtle ways I didn't yet know how to interpret. Later, when they thought I was asleep, I overheard them talking. My father said he feared the past would overshadow everything they had built. My mother said the truth had a way of returning no matter how firmly you tried to bury it. Her voice sounded weary, as though she had carried this burden alone for much longer than she admitted. I realized then that my family's history wasn't just a distant story. It lived in the pauses between their sentences, in the changes in their tone, in the quiet rules we followed without ever questioning them. I understood that the past had shaped our home in ways I had never noticed before, and these journals, whatever they contained, were about to change what I thought I knew about us. That night, I lay awake listening to the soft hum of the house. I sensed that everything was shifting, though I couldn't yet see the shape of the change. I only knew that I was standing at the quiet beginning of something that had started long before I was born, and that my family's silence was finally beginning to unravel. The envelope containing the sample of my grandfather's journal pages stayed on the mantelpiece for 2 days before my parents could bring themselves to discuss it again. My mother moved around the house with an unsettled quietness, and my father kept his hands busy, repairing small things that didn't really need fixing. Their silence made the air heavier, as though the house itself was waiting for something to be said aloud. I tried to keep my curiosity under control, yet the presence of those pages felt like a whisper I could not ignore. Every time I passed the mantelpiece, I felt a pull toward the pale envelope. My parents had told us to wait until they knew more, but I sensed from the beginning that these pages were not just records of daily life. They were fragments of a world that had shaped the older generations of my family in ways none of them had explained to me. On the third evening after dinner, my mother finally placed the envelope on the kitchen table. She called my brother and me to sit down with her. My father stood near the counter, arms crossed, his expression taut but controlled. I watched my mother's hands as she opened the envelope. The paper made a soft sound, but even that little noise felt significant. My mother unfolded the first sheet carefully. The handwriting was neat, slightly slanted, the sort of writing that belonged to someone who took time to shape each letter. She cleared her throat before reading aloud, though her voice wavered slightly at first. The entry was dated 1942. My grandfather had been a young man then, far younger than I had ever imagined him. He described leaving home at dawn, carrying only a small bag and a note he had written to his own mother. He explained his apprehension, how everything around him looked familiar, but felt different because he knew the world was changing faster than he could fully understand. The details of his surroundings were simple, nothing dramatic or frightening. He wrote about the cold morning air, the way the street lamps flickered, and the faint smell of coal that drifted through the neighborhood. But beneath those descriptions, there was something else, a tension in the tone, a quiet awareness that decisions made at that age would shape the rest of his life. My mother paused several times as she read, and each pause made me more aware of how deeply this story was connected to her. When she finished reading the first page, an uneasy silence filled the room. My father took the page from her and scanned it carefully, his brow furrowed. I could tell he was trying to measure how much of the past we were now obligated to carry. My brother seemed less affected, perhaps because he was younger, or simply because he preferred to avoid anything that stirred the emotions of our parents. The second page was shorter. My mother hesitated longer before reading it. This entry revealed my grandfather's reflections on the people he had met during that period. He mentioned a close friend, someone he trusted, and described how they tried to stay grounded despite the uncertainties surrounding them. Again, nothing graphic or distressing, just the quiet human side of a difficult time. But even these softer moments felt heavy because they hinted at everything he chose not to write. After she finished the second page, my mother folded the sheets and placed them back inside the envelope. She didn't seal it, but she held it with both hands, as though unsure whether to keep it or put it away. My father let out a slow breath and leaned forward on the counter, his eyes closed for a moment. It was the first sign that the emotional weight had reached him too. My mother looked at us with an expression I had rarely seen on her face. It was not fear, exactly, but a recognition that something long hidden was now unfolding. She told us that these entries were only small pieces of a larger story, and that the cousin who had contacted us believed he had the complete journals. My parents agreed to receive them, though I suspected they were still uncertain about whether they truly wanted to read them. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself wide awake. The envelope remained on the kitchen table, illuminated faintly by the streetlight filtering through the curtains. I knew I should leave it alone, yet the curiosity was too strong. I tiptoed into the kitchen and opened the envelope. I didn't take the pages out for long, just long enough to run my fingers over the paper. It felt old but well preserved, as though someone had taken great care to protect it. As I stood there, I imagined my grandfather as a young man, writing by candlelight or in a quiet corner of a crowded barracks. I wondered what fears he had carried, what he had kept to himself, and what had been too painful to record at all. I realized that the past had never truly been distant. It had lived in the silent gestures of my parents, in the rules of our household, in the unspoken limits they set to protect us from things they never fully explained. But when I returned the envelope to the table, I felt a shift inside me. I understood that my family's story was not only about what happened during those years, but also about how each generation had chosen to remember or forget. And now, without meaning to, I had taken my first step into the part of our history that had always been kept behind a closed door. As I grew older and spent more time with my family's letters and journals, I began to understand something I had not noticed as a child. The women in my family carried the weight of history differently yet, with remarkable resilience. My mother, Margaret, my grandmother, Elizabeth, and even the women before them, none of whom I had met, had faced challenges that were not written in textbooks. Their strength was quiet, unassuming, and yet it formed the foundation of the household in ways that affected every generation that followed. I recall sitting beside my grandmother in her small living room in Islington when I was 15. The space smelled faintly of lavender and worn books, and the afternoon light fell softly across the patterned rug. She had her knitting in her lap, her hands moving with the steady rhythm of decades of practice. I watched her carefully, fascinated by the calmness she exuded, and yet I sensed that this calm had been earned, not simply inherited. When I asked her about her childhood, she hesitated, then explained in measured words that life had been a series of adjustments, small compromises, difficult choices, and the constant responsibility of protecting family. She told me about her experiences during the early 1940s. Though she never spoke of danger in graphic terms, I learned that she spent many nights caring for younger children while managing household duties under the shadow of uncertainty. She described how she would wake at dawn to prepare meals, fetch water, and check on neighbors who were struggling. Her words were matter-of-fact, yet the underlying message was clear. She had learned early that the well-being of others could not be taken for granted. I realized that this sense of duty was not something she had chosen lightly. It was a necessity born from circumstances few people today could imagine. My mother, who had inherited similar lessons, displayed her own form of resilience. Growing up as an evacuee in the countryside, she often felt isolated from the life she had left behind in London. Letters from her parents arrived sporadically, and she had to navigate a strange household filled with children she barely knew. She learned patience, discretion, and an ability to adapt quickly to unfamiliar situations. Later, when I held her childhood letters in my hands, I could see in her careful handwriting a reflection of the quiet endurance that defined her character. As a child, I did not always understand these lessons. I sometimes wished for a mother who expressed frustration openly, or a grandmother who shared her emotions without restraint. But over time, I realized that their quietness was a form of strength. They bore responsibility without complaint, and they carried forward a sense of stability that allowed the family to survive emotionally, as well as physically. It was the subtle consistency of their care, the routine of meals, the preservation of small comforts, the vigilance in everyday life that made the household a place of safety. One of the most revealing moments occurred when I was 17. I found my grandmother's journal tucked into a drawer. Unlike the letters that were intended to be read, this was private, filled with reflections that had never been shared. She wrote about fears, hopes, and disappointments, often in simple sentences, yet the depth of her observations struck me. She reflected on the importance of remaining calm for the sake of others, even when anxiety or uncertainty threatened to overwhelm her. I realized then that her ability to bear silent burdens had shaped not only my mother's childhood, but also my own upbringing. The women in my family also taught me about the importance of memory and storytelling. Though they were cautious in what they shared, they preserved records, photographs, notes, keepsakes that captured everyday life as well as extraordinary moments. My grandmother often reminded me that even seemingly small actions, like keeping a diary or organizing family documents, were a way of honoring the experiences of those who came before us. It was a subtle insistence on remembrance, a quiet refusal to let ordinary courage go unnoticed. I also learned that resilience was not only about facing external challenges. It was about managing the emotional landscape of a household. My mother and grandmother navigated complex feelings, anticipating needs, soothing fears, and fostering a sense of continuity. This emotional labor was often invisible to outsiders, yet it shaped the rhythms of daily life. It influenced my behavior as well. I learned to observe, to listen, and to respond thoughtfully, absorbing lessons in empathy and responsibility long before I recognized their value. Looking back, I see now that the women in my family formed a silent network of guidance. They were anchors during periods of uncertainty, balancing their own fears with the needs of others. Their strength was not celebrated loudly, but it was enduring. And it was the reason our family weathered challenges that might have overwhelmed less steady hands. Each of their actions, small as they may have seemed, created a legacy of care and perseverance that I would carry into adulthood. As I moved into my early 20s, preparing for the journey to the United States, I realized how deeply this legacy had shaped me. I carried with me the lessons of resilience, discretion, and quiet courage that had been woven through generations. They were gifts without fanfare, but gifts that would sustain me when I faced the challenges of creating a new life far from the familiar streets of Hackney. I understood that honoring the women in my family was not just about remembering them, was about living the principles they had instilled, even when the world around me felt unfamiliar or unpredictable. In that understanding, I found both purpose and reassurance. The women who came before me had survived their own uncertainties, and through their strength, I had learned to navigate my own. Their legacy, though subtle and unspoken, had prepared me for the life ahead, and I carried it with quiet gratitude every day. Moving to the United States was nothing like I imagined as a child. I had pictured vast streets, endless opportunity, and a life that would somehow feel freer than the structured routines I had grown up with in Hackney. What I didn't anticipate was the depth of adjustment required, the quiet negotiation between the person I had been raised to be and the one the new world seemed to demand. My parents' lessons, their quiet resilience, became both my guide and my safety net. Michael met me at Heathrow, cheerful and encouraging, as if optimism could smooth every challenge that awaited me. I had packed lightly, carrying only a few essentials: a small notebook filled with memories of home, and the photograph of my parents standing in the garden. Even as the plane lifted off, I felt the weight of expectation, the unspoken responsibility to carry our family's history while stepping into something entirely unknown. I had been taught to observe carefully, and observation became my anchor on the long flight. Arriving in New York, the first thing I noticed was the energy, constant motion, the hum of conversation in every accent imaginable, and a feeling that life moved faster than I could comfortably follow. I clutched my small suitcase tightly, aware that my habits, picking the quietest lines at security, speaking softly, and scanning my surroundings were not universal here. The city seemed to reward boldness, yet my instincts leaned toward caution. A gift from my mother and grandmother that had kept me grounded throughout childhood. Our apartment in Queens was modest, but it felt full of possibility. Michael had prepared everything for my arrival: groceries, clean sheets, and a small desk for me to continue my writing. I appreciated his thoughtfulness, but I also felt a pang of unease. Every new sound, the wail of a siren, the laughter from the street below, the subway rumbling far beneath, reminded me that I was far from the familiar rhythms of Hackney. Yet in that distance I felt an odd liberation. Here the past could follow me, but it would not confine me. The first weeks were a series of small adjustments. I learned the layout of streets, the timing of buses, and the nuances of American etiquette that differed from the careful proprieties of London. Shopping for groceries became a lesson in flexibility. The quantities were larger, the brands unfamiliar, and the casual friendliness of strangers both disorienting and comforting. I discovered that adaptation required patience, not just patience with the new environment, but patience with myself as I struggled to reconcile my upbringing with the pace of life around me. One evening, after returning from my first week at the local library, I found Michael preparing dinner. The kitchen smelled of herbs and simmering vegetables. I watched him move through the space with ease, chatting casually about his day, and I realized that part of my challenge was learning to inhabit the space without constant internal caution. Observation had kept me safe in London, but here I needed a balance between vigilance and openness, a lesson that required daily practice. the library became a sanctuary. Among the quiet stacks, I could hear my own footsteps, smell the faint aroma of old books, and feel the structured calm that had always been my comfort. My job involved organizing collections, assisting visitors, and reading to children in small storytelling sessions. These tasks allowed me to build confidence, connecting with people while maintaining a sense of order. The library, in its gentle rhythm, reminded me that I could bring pieces of my upbringing into this new world without losing myself entirely. Evenings were spent exploring the city, walking along avenues I had only seen in photographs. Noticing the diversity of life around me, I observed families, young couples, and older neighbors, noting the similarities and differences to those I had known in Hackney. I realized that the principles my mother and grandmother had instilled, quiet endurance, empathy, attention to detail, were universally valuable, even in a bustling city that prized spontaneity and volume. My family's legacy traveled with me, invisible yet potent, shaping the way I approached new experiences. Of course, distance brought moments of longing. I missed the familiar architecture of London, the small brick streets, and the cadence of my parents' voices. Letters and occasional phone calls provided reassurance, yet they also reminded me that life back home continued without me. I carried their guidance in my heart. The importance of maintaining routine, of observing carefully, of valuing small gestures of care. These lessons were not restrictive. They were tools that helped me thrive even far from home. In those early months, I also became aware of the subtle differences in cultural expectation. People spoke freely about themselves, often revealing intimate details to strangers. I found this both challenging and enlightening. I learned to navigate these interactions with discretion, balancing openness with the careful listening skills honed over years in my family's home. Each conversation became an exercise in discernment, teaching me that resilience could manifest in flexibility as much as in caution. Looking back now, I recognize that my first months in America were formative in ways I hadn't understood at the time. They taught me how to carry my past without being constrained by it. How to blend the quiet lessons of my family with the boldness the city required, and how to build a life that respected both history and possibility. I was far from Hackney, yet I felt the presence of my ancestors in every careful choice, in every act of observation, and in every moment of quiet perseverance. The new life I was creating was not a departure from the past, it was its continuation, shaped by distance but firmly rooted in everything my family had taught me. By the time I had been living in the United States for 3 years, I had settled into a routine that felt comfortable yet constantly reminded me of the distance between my past and present. The streets of Queens no longer felt foreign. They had become familiar territory, each corner and storefront mapped in my mind like a guide to daily life. Yet no matter how much I adapted, there remained a part of me that longed for the cadence of my childhood streets in Hackney, the quiet rhythm of my family's home, and the stories my parents had carried silently for decades. It was a rainy autumn afternoon when I received the call from my mother. Her voice, usually composed, trembled slightly, a subtle shift I could recognize immediately. She told me that my grandmother had passed away quietly in her sleep. The news brought a rush of memories of afternoons spent listening to her stories, of sitting beside her as she knitted and hummed quietly to herself, of the soft gestures that had taught me so much about resilience, patience, and empathy. I felt a profound sense of loss, tempered by the realization that her life had been rich in quiet heroism, shaping generations in ways that were invisible yet enduring. Within days, I booked a flight to London, determined to reconnect with home and immerse myself once more in the atmosphere that had defined my earliest years. Stepping off the plane at Heathrow, the familiar smells and sounds damp pavement, distant bus engines, and the chatter of people walking briskly to catch trains immediately grounded me. It was as if a layer of my identity, paused for years, had been reactivated. Every street corner seemed to echo with fragments of my childhood, reminding me of routines, conversations, and quiet moments I had long carried in memory. Returning to Hackney was a strange combination of comfort and disorientation. Our old flat had been renovated, the walls painted in muted tones, the floor replaced, and some furniture replaced entirely. Yet despite these physical changes, the essence of home lingered in subtle ways, the way sunlight filtered through the windows at a particular angle in the late afternoon, the soft creak of the stairs, the rhythm of neighbors moving about their routines. It was familiar yet changed, a reminder that memory and place exist in delicate tandem. Sitting in my parents' kitchen, I realized that the stories I had absorbed as a child, the tales of resilience, endurance, and careful observation, had become more meaningful in their absence. My grandmother's quiet guidance, my mother's careful planning, and my father's steady presence had all contributed to the structure of my own identity. Now, standing in the same space, I understood more deeply that these lessons were not confined to memory alone. They shaped actions, decisions, and approaches to life that persisted across decades. During my stay, I spent hours going through the journals my grandmother had left behind. Her handwriting, neat and precise, conveyed observations about daily life, reflections on family, and the small acts of care that had maintained stability in our home. As I read, I noticed that she had recorded not just events, but emotions, her fears, hopes, and small victories. These writings revealed the full depth of her attentiveness to the well-being of our family. Her strength had always been quiet, almost invisible. Yet it was foundational, the unseen scaffolding that held our family together. The journals also illuminated relationships that had been only partially understood. I discovered letters between my grandmother and friends who had shared similar experiences during and after the war. Letters filled with empathy, advice, and the simple acknowledgement that survival required both internal resilience and communal support. These women had lived lives that were in many ways extensions of one another, passing guidance, wisdom, and emotional stability across households and generations. I realized that my family's legacy was not only preserved through direct lineage, but through the networks of quiet support that had sustained them. One afternoon, I sat in the garden with my mother, now older but still composed. The garden had changed, flowers in bloom in places my grandmother would have tended with care. We spoke at length about our family's pastor, about the journals, the letters, and the quiet endurance that had defined our upbringing. I listened carefully, recognizing the subtle ways she conveyed history without dramatization, passing lessons on resilience, observation, and emotional stewardship. I felt an understanding deepen between us, a connection strengthened by shared memory and reflection. I also thought of my life in the United States and the lessons I had carried with me, the routines I had developed, the patience I had cultivated, and the attentiveness I had practiced in social and professional contexts were all influenced by my upbringing, even thousands of miles away. The foundations built by my grandmother and mother informed my perspective, guiding my responses, decisions, and relationships. I realized that home is not only a physical place, but a repository of values, memories, and emotional patterns that persist across time and space. By the time I returned to America, I had a renewed sense of purpose. I understood that the quiet endurance of the women in my family was not simply historical, it was living legacy. I carried it with me not as a burden, but as a source of guidance, shaping how I faced challenges, how I nurtured relationships, and how I approached the unpredictable aspects of life. The past and present, separated by oceans, were bound together through memory, observation, and the continuous influence of the family that had nurtured me. This journey back to Hackney reminded me that even as life moves forward, connection to one's roots remains vital. It is in the quiet attention to memory, the careful preservation of lessons, and the acknowledgement of those who came before us that we find the strength to navigate our own lives. And as I resumed my life in America, I carried this understanding with me. Determined to honor the resilience of my family while continuing to build a life informed by their legacy, yet shaped by my own choices. At 69, I finally feel the weight and the purpose of the stories I carry. It is a strange sensation knowing that my life is no longer only my own, but also a vessel for memory, history, and the silent courage of the generations who came before me. I am Ruth Thompson, a woman born and raised in Hackney, a member of the baby boomer generation, now living thousands of miles from the streets of my childhood. Yet every memory, every quiet lesson has traveled with me, shaping the person I have become and the family I now hope to preserve. The process of gathering our family's past began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Letters, photographs, and journals that my grandmother, mother, and distant cousins had preserved were scattered across drawers, boxes, and envelopes. Over the years, I brought them together, sorting, reading, and understanding the quiet patterns that connected our lives. Each piece revealed resilience in small doses, the way my mother organized our home, the way my grandmother had documented her observations of the world, and even the subtle habits of my father that reflected experiences left unspoken. Collectively, they formed an intricate tapestry that explained not just who we were, but why we had endured the way we had. One evening, as I sat at my desk with a cup of tea, I realized that writing these memories down was more than an act of preservation. It was an act of giving life to those who had shaped me. I thought of my children and grandchildren, imagining them years from now reading about a time they never lived in, understanding choices and values that seemed ordinary at the time but were, in fact, extraordinary. The act of recording history in my own voice, in my own words, became a responsibility I could no longer ignore. I had learned to listen quietly, but now I had to speak clearly, bridging the silence of decades with stories that would survive the years. As I worked, I recalled my first experiences reading my grandmother's journals. Her handwriting, precise and delicate, had held more than observations. It had contained subtle lessons in patience, empathy, and perseverance. She had written about mundane tasks, preparing meals, tending to children, arranging flowers, but beneath these ordinary acts lay the essence of our family's resilience. I began to see my own life mirrored in hers, the routines I had developed, the attentiveness to others, and the quiet strength that guided my decisions. By documenting her experiences alongside my own, I realized that the narrative of a family is never linear. It is cyclical, continuous, and deeply intertwined with the lessons passed from one generation to another. There were moments when the responsibility felt overwhelming. Sorting through decades of memory, I sometimes wondered if I could capture the essence of what my parents, grandparents, and even ancestors had lived through without embellishment or distortion. I reminded myself that my duty was not to dramatize, but to observe honestly the way they had taught me. Every detail mattered, from the simple patterns of daily life to the small gestures that revealed character, courage, and care. In honoring these details, I honored the people themselves. I also confronted the reality of change. Places once familiar had transformed. Streets in Hackney were no longer the ones I had walked as a child, and family members were scattered across continents. Yet I realized that memory transcends geography. By recording our stories, I created a bridge across distance and time, ensuring that the essence of our family, the quiet lessons, the small acts of courage, and the continuity of care would remain accessible to those who followed. Physical spaces may shift, but memory, once captured, endures. In writing, I discovered that the act itself became healing. At long-held tensions, the weight of unspoken fears, and the accumulated responsibility of carrying our family's past all found a place on the page. I no longer felt bound by silence. Instead, I felt empowered to honor the lives and choices of my ancestors while asserting my own voice. The narrative of my life, intertwined with theirs, became a testament not only to survival but to understanding, reflection, and connection. I thought often about the women who shaped me, my grandmother's quiet determination, my mother's careful guidance, and even my own role in continuing their legacy. Their influence had been subtle, woven into routines, small acts, and patient observation. Yet now, by committing these experiences to writing, I realized that their strength had prepared me to create continuity, to ensure that the values, lessons, and stories of our family would not be lost. In this realization, I found clarity. The past does not vanish. It is carried forward by those willing to remember and to share. As the years advance, I understand that memory is both fragile and resilient. It can be forgotten if left unattended, yet it can endure when nurtured through storytelling, reflection, and preservation. The journals, letters, and personal accounts are more than historical records. They are threads connecting generations. Through them, I can trace the shape of our family, the quiet courage that allowed us to endure, and the lessons that continue to guide our lives. I write now with the intent that future generations, whether they live in London, New York, or anywhere else, will understand who came before them. They will learn about choices made in times of uncertainty, the power of small acts of care, and the importance of preserving memory. They will see that resilience often comes quietly, without fanfare, yet its impact is profound. My responsibility is no longer to contain the past, but to transmit it, ensuring that the voices of my family, especially those who endured without recognition, continue to resonate. Sitting in my home, looking at the collection I have gathered, I feel a sense of completion. This is not the end of our story. It is a foundation. Future generations will add their experiences, interpretations, and lessons. Yet the legacy I carry now is solid and enduring. Built from decades of quiet resilience, careful observation, and love that survives the silence of years. I am both witness and storyteller, and in this role I find peace. Our history will not be forgotten. It lives on in memory, in writing, and in the hearts of those who come after me.